For centuries, man and women sailed the seas without the guidance of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. No apps or cell phones to help predict Poseidon's breeze. Yes, many ships were lost at sea, but many more made it safely to port. That is because there was a way to watch the weather in those days. A way without smartphones. A way that is still useful to this day. To understand how to read the weather, we first need to go over the basics. There's no point in pulling up your favorite wind app if you can't understand the nomenclature. And while I'm sure the app has some snazzy animation to make the data more digestible, it is easy to read the data itself. Starting with wind. You can tell the difference between a boating app and your local surf report because wind is measured in knots. A northwest wind at 12 knots is just how it sounds. 12 nautical miles an hour blowing in from the northwest. Useful information, but far more powerful when combined with the hourly forecast. This way, you can determine whether the wind is growing stronger or dying off. Another common statistic attached to wind forecast is gust. Unlike waves, wind can blow stronger or weaker at any moment. Because of this, 12 knots of wind is essentially the minimum wind that you can expect for that hour. When paired with gusts of 16 to 20 knots, the day becomes a bit more treacherous. Swell works a bit differently. While its direction is still measured on a compass, it's not measured in speed. It's measured in its size and its frequency. 1.4 meters at 17 seconds. This data can look a bit more daunting than wind, but I assure you it's not. 1.4 meters is the height of the wave from its peak, or its highest point, to its trough, or its lowest point. The following number, measured in seconds, is the frequencies of the waves. This number is called the swell's period. It takes the time between the point of one wave, say its peak, and how long it takes for the next peak to reach that same place in space. This is easy to visualize as a stationary buoy. When the first wave rises the buoy to its highest point, the timer starts, and it is stopped when the next wave raises the buoy back up. So what does all this mean? Well, much like a wind's speed and gust, it's important to look at a swell's numbers together. A swell with a high wave can sound scary, but if it also has a long period, then you're more at danger of getting seasick than you are of sinking. Large waves and long period swells originate from storms many hundreds to thousands of miles away from their destination. Because of this, the ride can be rolly, but very mellow. In fact, unless you are battling Dungeness crabs up in the Arctic, most boat losses occur in short period swells, many of which are considered fairly small waves. Short period swells are dangerous because the waves are unrelenting. Caused by local conditions, short period swells are the result of hard, strong, close winds. Commonplace on lakes and inlets, short period swells batter and damage boats due to the constant rising and slamming into the waves, beating up both the vessel and its occupants. Just look at the Great Lakes. Out of reach of hurricanes, yet with an estimated 6,000 shipwrecks compared to Florida's 5,000. So with the nomenclature now under our belt, our phone goes overboard. So, what is the weather doing? Reading the weather can be difficult even with modern technology. Cold fronts, warm fronts, high pressure, low pressure, all complicated stuff. But there are 3 observations I make on the water every day to help me navigate the weather. For starters, we can get our wind and swell without any of that pesky electronic nonsense. For the swell, when stopped in the water, time how long it takes for your bow to go to the top of a wave, to the bottom, and back up to the top, and that'll give you the swell's period. Yes, you'll likely be drifting, but we're not looking to set any weights and measures awards here. Height of a wave can be estimated based off navigation buoys, or knowing the height of your bow. Wind is a bit more fun. Just by looking at the texture of the water, you can determine wind speed and direction to within a few knots. There are 13 different types of wind speed in the Boater's Bible. That's Chapman's Piloting and Seamanship. But if we group a few of them together, we have calm, gentle breeze, fresh breeze, gale, storm, and hurricane. The sea state changes in each of these categories. For example, in the calm wind, the water looks like glass, with very little ripples shimmering across the surface, 0 to 3 knots. In a gentle breeze, wavelets begin to form and small crests are visible, 4 to 10 knots. A fresh breeze, fresh like the mint in your mojito, is the whitecap phase, starting at 10 knots with long-form waves growing towards the upper wind speeds of 27 knots. Gale follows with foam forming and blowing across the water in streaks, 28 to 47 knots. Then we get to a storm, a phrase many of us use too loosely based on the book's definition. Very high waves that break, topple, and tumble boats of small or medium size may be obscured, 48 to 63 knots. And finally, the hurricane. If you find yourself in a hurricane, you can tell by the smell of your pants and your proximity to God. But if you make it out, you would have seen almost nothing but a driving white spray, 64 to 71 knots. Not many outside of the Coast Guard will find themselves in these situations, but familiarizing yourself with the lower wind speed indications is very useful. There is a noticeable difference in sea state for the lower wind speeds. I know what you're thinking though. Isn't it a little late to be reading the weather if I'm already out on the water? And it can be, but if you keep a detailed log throughout the day, you can determine whether the weather is getting better or whether it's getting worse. This will tell you if it's time to head in or if you're still looking good. While wind and waves are industry leaders in ruining boat days, there are other forms of weather out there. The rest of the weather ruins boats' weeks. Which leads to my other two old school methods. And the first is daydreaming. Don't let the hustle and bustle of everyday life keep you from kicking back and looking up at some clouds. That one over there looks like a dolphin. That one looks like two dogs humping. And that one right in front of me looks like a thunderhead about to destroy my mast. Shit. Cloud observation sounds like a pretty simple tip. Had to dig real hard for that one, huh, Jake? But cloud recognition can save your ship. And you don't have to wait for lightning to strike to recognize a storm's coming. Saving you from the excruciating details of atmospheric meteorology, here are a few clouds to look out for. The first being cirrus. These clouds are often known by their other name as mare's tails. For centuries, sailors have kept a keen eye on these high-altitude clouds. With today's science, they are known to indicate that a warm front is approaching. In the olden days, they were known for mare's tails and mackerel scales make lofty ships carry low sails, an indication of a storm, which leads us to the mackerel scales, otherwise known as cirrocumulus. These clouds are known for their appearance during a change in weather. For old sailors, if mare's tails meant a storm was approaching, then mackerel scales meant that it was for certain. Being the cloud of change, cirrocumulus can also be a good indicator if seen after a recent storm. This means that you're likely on your way to some calmer seas. All kinds of clouds can be read this way to determine future weather. If you include wind direction, then things can get really complicated. So I'll leave you with one more fair weather display before moving on. The cumulus, a classic cloud, the one that looked like dogs humping. When spotted over land, this cloud signals thermals. The air rushing towards the cloud over land gives a promising sea breeze to those sailors out on the water. These clouds, however, can still grow into cumulonimbus storm clouds, so be sure to keep an eye on them. Which brings me to our last method of reading the weather without using a binky. Or, cell phone. And that's to keep an eye on a barometer. Long forgotten next to the thermostat, compass, and mechanical clock is the barometer. A tool from yesteryear which has been retired by many and now has a new life as an ornament on the wall of a salon. Barometers were developed in 1643 by an Italian man by the name of Torricelli. They are used to determine current atmospheric pressure, which, whether you believe it or not, can be useful in a sailor's fight against nature. The barometer is simple. It's a gauge that gives you the current atmospheric pressure. The reason this is so useful is because the atmosphere changes. And not only does it change, but it has a favorable state, higher pressure, and a less favorable one, lower pressure. Generally, low pressure is associated with cooler climates, precipitation, wind, and storms. So, by using a barometer, you could take the atmosphere's current pressure and track how it changes. A stagnant or rising pressure assures the sailor of fair weather. On the other hand, a rapidly decreasing pressure hurries the sailor into port. Of course, the atmospheric pressure is going to go up and down depending on time and temperature of the day, which is why the rate of change is the most important factor. In inches, a drop of -0.02 can be considered normal. However, a drop of -0.05 in the course of 1 hour can be cause for concern. But with this tool, our journey through the dark ages comes to an end. Pull your phone out of the water and hit the repair store. Analog story time is over. Just do me one last favor next time you're out on the water. Set your phone down. Take a look around, check out the water, look at some clouds, hell, maybe even get yourself a barometer. I think you'll impress yourself in what you can see.